When you talk about whatever you want to call it, a Pacific State Federation, a Pacific State Union, some kind of soft secession, that involves reimagining what this country looks like. And that comes down to power, reimagining power arrangements and understanding where power really comes from.
What if everything you've been told about the economy, about housing, inflation, and government debt was upside down? What if the problem isn't that we're spending too much, but that we're letting the wrong people decide what we spend on? What if you feel rich when you leave the West Coast and poor when you live in or visit our big cities like LA, San Francisco, and Seattle? I'm Greg Amrofell. In this episode of Pacific Time, I sit down with David Goldstein. Goldy, as he's known, is an irreverent political strategist at Civic Ventures, where he co-hosts the Pitchfork Economics podcast with billionaire provocateur Nick Hanauer. Goldy is also co-founder of the legendary blog horsesass.org and one of the sharpest, most foul-mouthed interpreters of the economics in America. For years, Goldy's been calling out the structural scam in our economy, the way federal policy, corporate lobbying, and investor-driven markets keep ordinary people locked out of owning their own communities. This is not a whine of victimhood because, let's be honest, we're perpetuating traps of our own making. Goldy argues that if the West Coast wants to lead on housing, homelessness, climate, or even democracy, we cannot do it inside an economy that's designed to fail us. The broad-based prosperity that once defined the American dream has curdled into myth. This fuels the outrage that Trump mines with terrifying precision. It has also hollowed out our middle class. And if we don't get busy crushing the false idols and liberal economic thinking, we consign ourselves to eating scraps in a rotten MAGA dystopia. Goldy isn't just railing at Trump, he's offering a prescription. It's about matching a hopeful message of abundance with an economics of abundance. Good news. Goldy suggests we on the West Coast are very lucky to afford it. In this conversation, we rock the boat on what economic power really means, why affordable housing isn't just about zoning or NIMBYs, but about who controls the money. We talk about moving past the policies that favor Wall Street, big tech, and ballroom building mafia bosses in DC. We talk about how states could start claiming power through reclaiming federal taxes, public banking, and public options for healthcare and housing. If you think that this sounds radical, you're right. But as Goldy reminds us, the real radicals are the ones defending the status quo that is not working for most of us. I started by inviting David to slaughter some sacred cows in economics.
You know, we puncture the myth that in orthodox economics, there is no power. They don't even talk about power. It doesn't exist. And one of the things that we argue is that it's really all about power. In the end, it's this power relationship between workers and employers, between owners and renters, throughout the economy. Power is shaping every economic decision that people make, but it's absent from orthodox economic models because it doesn't fit into their model. If there's power, you can't mathematize that, you can't quantify it, and so you can't build this nice, neat, in equilibrium model, which will explain how a power imbalance will impact the price of a product through the interaction of supply and demand. So it's just ignored. It's assumed it doesn't exist, that the market will work all power out of the system.
The old line that economists haven't met real humans, they've just modeled them.
Right. Well, if you talk to them, and we do talk to a lot of them, they say, well, of course we don't believe this stuff. It's just, but this is how we teach it at the introductory level. And of course, our big beef is that most people, if they study economics at all, they don't get past the introductory level. And if you don't study economics, you're getting it via osmosis through people who never got past the introductory level. And so that's what influences our policymakers, our politicians, our pundits, journalists, thought leaders. It's mostly this set of very rigid fantasy ideas about how the economy works.
Okay. You're saying now, and you've said before, that political power follows economic power. Where does economic power reside today on the West Coast? And how does that compare to Washington, D.C. or Wall Street?
It's ownership, of course. It's always ownership. Obviously there are things that can balance that off, but when you look at when you look at a city like Seattle, and we're making a distinction here between political power and economic power, and they overlap because unfortunately, you can purchase political power, and that's a lot of what's gone wrong with our democracy. The power has always been in the largest companies and the wealthiest individuals. So the power is in Microsoft and Boeing and Amazon and Starbucks and anybody else who is a big employer or a big landowner, a big taxpayer, somebody who hires a lot of lobbyists. So when we have these debates over taxation in Washington state, it's something that's almost impossible to ever address effectively because capital does not want to be taxed.
So if the West Coast is one of the largest economies in the world, why does it feel like we're at the mercy of national policy and capital markets that are not based here?
Right. Well, first of all, we're always at the mercy of global capital markets. It's one of the reasons why it makes housing, particularly on the rental side, so hard to address, because if in fact we ever were to bring down the price of housing on the market, then capital would swoop in and bid the price back up, because they already know that we can pay more for housing than that 30% rule, 30% of pre-tax income says we can, because most people do pay more for it. So that's what the market would call the equilibrium price, the market clearing price. What are people actually paying? So this idea that somehow Seattle can fix its housing market and San Francisco doesn't, well, what will happen then, if it's so much cheaper to live and work in Seattle, then businesses will move here and people will move here until it bids the prices right back up. So these big problems really have to be addressed at least a regional, if not national level.
Let's come back to housing. There's a lot to dig into there. I still want to focus on this sort of disparity between West Coast political power and West Coast economy. I mean, California loves to say that it's the fourth largest economy in the world. And actually, when you roll in Washington state, we become the third largest economy in the world. And yet here we are getting bossed around by people who don't live or operate on the West Coast. Why?
Well, it's the nature of our political system and the norms and institutions that have grown up around it. We have a broken constitution. That shouldn't be a surprise because it was always broken. It was always a bad constitution. This idea that somehow the Constitution is what protected American democracy is silly. 70 years after that Constitution was passed, we ended up in a bloody civil war. We were leading to that almost from the beginning. And what we had was a constitution crafted for a slave republic meant to overrepresent the interest of slave-holding elites. That's why you had things like the Electoral College, why you had the Three-Fifths Compromise, why you ended up with things like the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850. And really, when it all falls apart in 1860, it's a demographic problem for the slave-owning states because the population in the North was growing so much faster that these built-in mechanisms within the Constitution, within the Senate, within the Electoral College, etc., they were being overwhelmed by a growing population in the North. And it was clear after the 1860 election that they would never be able to control the House again, and they would likely never be able to control the Electoral College. And so they made this bet at that point that, well, the Constitution really, we've been ignoring it a lot anyway. The North's not going to go to war to defend that. And we probably wouldn't if not for an obstinate president who decided he was going to put all his political capital on the line to hold the Union together, because clearly anybody else in the White House might have said, no, it's not worth it, right? We don't want to go to war for that. It would be horrific. And it was more horrific than anybody thought it would be. And yet we still went through it. In the end, the only reason why Grant was successful where other generals were not was that he was willing to have mass casualties. He was just willing to get his men slaughtered and realized he had larger numbers and greater resources than the South, and the South couldn't withstand that. And that's how the North won that war. So we were headed to civil war from the start because it was a bad constitution. What holds the nation together when we're held together isn't this piece of parchment. It's a set of democratic norms that govern the way we behave. And so we honor the rule of law because that's a norm. We follow the rulings of the Constitution because that's a norm. We don't do the sort of things that President Trump is now doing because we had norms that prevented us from doing that. 40 years ago, he would have been impeached and convicted. The things you're doing, crimes every day. He literally tore down part of the White House. He's appointing people to the Justice Department and demanding that they pay him $230 million. I mean, this is every day. It's not one outrage. It's a dozen more outrages. I don't know, the hearing of his ambassador to South Africa today where he wouldn't say that he opposed a policy, an immigration policy where only white people could come to the U.S. He wouldn't say that he opposed changing the law so that only white people can vote. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, normally, even if you didn't believe in these things, you would just say it because that's a norm. But now everything is so shattered. So to understand our current idea of what the United States is, it's not defined in the Constitution as clearly as people think it is. It's a set of norms and institutions. And so if we want a certain amount of independence on the West Coast, enough to maintain our freedom, our liberty, and our economy, if what we want is a functional democracy and a inclusive and sustainable and broadly prosperous economy, well, then we need to recognize that we need new norms. And so to me, when you talk about something like whatever you want to call it, a Pacific State Federation, a Pacific State Union, some kind of soft secession, that involves reimagining what this country looks like. And that comes down to power, reimagining power arrangements and understanding where power really comes from. In our current system, power basically comes from three places. It comes from norms. It comes from compliance and pre-compliance. We obey the rule of law. So if the Supreme Court rules that, oh, no, we can't distribute mifepristone anymore and no more abortion pills, it's the Supreme Court. They said it. We have to follow. And that's the way things used to work. For the most part, not always. There's been a lot of exceptions, medical and recreational marijuana in particular. So that's the main way that power is enforced, and we just agree to obey it. The second way is through the purse. The federal government has money, and they can threaten to withhold it from you, and Trump is already doing that, where he's spending money in the red states and he's taking money away from the blue states. But the thing about that power is that it's only in the threat. Once you carry it out, once you take that money away, it's not a threat anymore. You've already done it. So you can use it once, but once it's gone, that's gone. And the third way you assert power in our system is through physical violence, through state violence. And I have to say, a year ago, when I first started thinking through this, I underestimated how quickly the Trump administration would move to building a domestic army, which is what ICE is, what they're doing right now, how quickly they would expand it, how much money they would put into it, and how willing they were to use it. So that combined with calling out the National Guard, I think it's more problematic at this point for them to use regular military, because I don't know that the generals will cooperate. They seem intent on using physical force. They want to bring hell down on American cities. It's not that they're trying to quell violence, they're trying to create violence. That is clear. So, but at least up until now, and I think at least for the moment, they do not have the policing power to enforce their will. And the federal government never did. When it required violence, it largely required on cooperation from state and local law enforcement to carry out their orders and their laws. And if we refuse to comply with that, they currently do not have the manpower or the resources to impose their will in, a dozen blue cities all at once.
You're circling around the question at the heart of not just this discussion, but the whole podcast, which is, what if the West Coast could start from scratch? I mean, question number one is the West Coast wise to just concentrate on itself? Or does the West Coast need to become a sanctuary for the way it ought to be done or has been done, looking to improve itself and become a beacon on the hill for other parts of the country? Is it right to be internally focused or to be externally focused?
I think it's wrong to say that those are not interrelated. I think being internally focused is being externally focused because, the phrase that I use is that we need to build the America we want where we can build it, and then offer that as a refuge and a beacon to the rest of the nation on how to do things right. Some years back, we used to bandy about the term in the office, Cascadian capitalism versus Confederate capitalism, which wasn't exactly right. But it alliterated and it made us feel good. But it gets to kind of a point. There are different ways of approaching politics and different ways of approaching the economy. Now, I should say we can't start from scratch. Like people who talk about secession, that is unrealistic. That's never going to happen. We do have a constitution. We do have a certain structure. It's just not reasonable to think that we can break the country apart. And also, do you really want a bunch of heavily armed independent states or regional coalitions of states arming themselves and fighting their own wars? I don't think so. I don't think that turns out well for us. I think Texas ends up kicking our ass. So that's not what we want. But what we can do is reimagine the relationship between the states and the federal government and the states with each other. And you see that this nascent exercise of that in the West Coast Health Alliance, where initially California, Oregon, and Washington, and then Hawaii came in a little later. They're setting their own standards on vaccines. And you can imagine expanding that to, let's say they get rid of Obamacare. They essentially by allowing the subsidies to expire, they are getting rid of Obamacare for a lot of people. It's to say that your premiums are going to double. People are going to see a 40 to 200% increase in their premiums. No, that's misunderstanding the situation. People are not going to have health insurance because they're not going to be able to afford to spend an additional $12,000 a year on health insurance. So millions of people will not have health insurance. So one could imagine, largely thanks to California, California is the most important player here because it is so large. And this is especially true when it comes to social insurance programs because it provides such a huge risk pool to spread that risk around. You could imagine a 3-state public option, which you could do in defiance of federal law or the courts. The courts would say, no, you can't do that. And we can just say, what are you going to do? Invade us to prevent people from getting health care? I mean, I guess. The optics are pretty bad that you're going to be like posting people in doctors' offices, troops in doctors' offices and emergency rooms, preventing people from getting treatment, or dragging doctors, to prison for providing treatment. They could try that. I think everything falls apart once you do that, nationally, not just here. So you can imagine expanding that out where we obviously can't rely on the federal government to do this anymore. So what do? Do we go without healthcare? Because no real functional modern economy can survive that way. We're going to become uncompetitive and dysfunctional if people don't have healthcare. There's money to be saved from providing healthcare. So we could work together and just decide we're going to do it our own way. And we're going to do it ourselves. And if you move out here and establish residency, you'll have access to our healthcare too. And that becomes both an attraction for people to move out to the West Coast states, and also it provides an example to go back to their own governments and which are now being gerrymandered to be 100% red in representation, and say, no, we want that thing there or else we're leaving. So you can look at it and see it works. And at that point, the sorting works to our advantage within the current structure of the Electoral College and the House, because if we gain population and they lose population, we gain representation and they lose it. So a long play is to actually mass migration to the blue states. That is the long play. Doesn't help us in the Senate, but it helps us in the Electoral College and the House. And you can see that on a number of things. We can have a single university system. It could be separate university systems, but we all share. Every citizen of Washington, Oregon, and California get in-state tuition at any of those universities, the state colleges and universities. There's a lot of things that we can do to improve services and improve investments on our own.
I want to go back to the kind of model of power that you put forward, this sort of compliance and pre-compliance, the power of the purse, and the backing of physical violence or kind of military strength. I mean, in this example that you're citing of, kind of a West Coast health system, you're saying, hey, let's get past the, if the federal rules are not working for us, we're going to set our own and let someone come after us. You're saying, you could invade with the National Guard, but that's a bad visual. But let's zero in on the purse, on the money here. It feels like it's becoming a trope at this point. But look, the West Coast is a donor region of the country to the tune of $100 billion. We spend in federal tax $100 billion a year more than we get back, and the amount we get back seems to be declining quite rapidly. How can we reclaim the funds we need to not just make symbolic gestures like a West Coast Health Alliance, but to programmatically invest in improving what's happening here?
So first, I just want to say that this is the way it's always been and the way it should be. Like Seattle is King County here in Washington is a donor county to the rest of the state. We get back about 65 cents for every tax dollar we send to the state. And then you have some eastern and central counties that get back like $7 for every dollar they send. And it makes sense. The Greek economist Yanis Varoufakis says this was the problem with the Eurozone, is that it was monetary union without political union. And you have surplus states or surplus cities, surplus regions, and you have deficit regions. And the only way for that monetary system to work so that these deficit places can afford to buy the stuff we make, the goods and services we make, is to recycle our surpluses through those areas. So there's an economic logic to King County subsidizing the rest of the state, or in a functional political system for California and Washington to be subsidizing red states or the red areas of red. It's rural versus urban for the most part. So let's start there. I'm not opposed to those subsidies on an economic or humanitarian level. Politically, obviously, it's being used as a weapon against us. They're making us pay taxes and then sending it all as tribute to their own supporters. And that's not tenable in the long run. It's very difficult to address because states don't pay taxes to the federal government, individuals do. So you and I could decide and I feel this way. I've joked about this. I feel like quitting my job so I no longer have to pay taxes to this regime. There are other ways I could go. I'm not wealthy enough, like my boss, Nick Hanauer, he's wealthy enough that if he wanted to find legal ways to not pay taxes, he could, right? Me already, because he's a billionaire, he pays a much lower rate in the end, effective rate than I do, because that's the way the tax system is set up. But for somebody like me or for you, it's very hard to evade our taxes. So that requires change in DC. I think there is a political path to this, which is the Republican Party is the anti-tax party. I mean, they never saw a tax cut they didn't like. I could imagine if you could get Democrats behind it, if Democrats went and promoted, let's say we're going to raise the standard exemption from $16,000 for an individual to $160,000 per individual, which means most people won't pay the federal income tax anymore. I would love to see Republicans have to vote that down. And most of them would have to. But all you need is a handful of them to vote for it. A handful of true drown the government in a bathtub, Grover Norquist libertarians to vote with the Democrats to pass something like that. And then if you lower federal taxes on the blue states, that creates fiscal space within the blue states to raise our own taxes to pay for the things we need. And because we're not exporting that to red states, we can end up with better services, more focused on what we want at a lower cost than sharing our wealth with the federal government. Again, morally and economically, for this country to really work, we should be recycling surpluses. But maybe instead of being America, we should be Germany and just trying to keep all our surpluses to ourselves. We get the exports and we spend our money locally, and we don't want to send our money elsewhere, which was part of the problem with the European financial collapse with Greece and Portugal and so forth, is that Germany did not want to make good on those debts.
First of all, I've sort of wondered if Russell Vogt and the Heritage Foundation if their evil schemes are coming to pass, and that they are advocates of smaller government, and they're waiting for people in blue cities and blue states to say, we're ready for smaller government, we're ready to cut federal tax, and then it's up to us to make our own decisions more locally about how we raise revenue to support the programs that address our issues. Also, it's just such an interesting dynamic in that the critique of blue states and blue cities from the Republican Party, from Donald Trump, is that we haven't been able to keep up with our own problems, and yet they're starving us of the resources to actually help address our own problems.
I mean, obviously, this idea that these are crime-ridden, shuttered up hellholes is, of course, bullshit. You walk the streets of Seattle. Yeah. Have we fully recovered from COVID? No, we don't have the type of daytime traffic that we used to have. And that is largely a function of work from home still being a big part of the economy here. And that's largely a consequence of the type of economy we have. We have a big tech economy where we can work from home. I go into the office maybe one day a week for half a day. I argue that it's not even necessary. I write, I podcast, I do it all from home. People joke about a general strike. Like if I were to go on strike, who would know? Which is a downside. There's no power there. Yes. So obviously, one of the reasons why the federal government is where we have to go to traditionally to fix big problems is because that's where most of the money is. That's the state and local taxes are tiny compared to federal taxes. That's where most of the money is. And in a functional democracy, that makes sense because, you want to have done things like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which improved the lives of millions and modernized that economy. At the time, Roosevelt started the Tennessee Valley Authority, it was something like 5% of homes there were wired for electricity. So it's life-changing when you make those investments. You look at all of Eastern Washington, the roads, the irrigation, the power, the transportation system, that's all paid for by our dollars. That's all subsidized by Seattle. But of course, it's good to have them growing food there, right? And it's good to have people who can make a decent living and live a comfortable and dignified life out there so that they're growing food so that we have it. So that they're, if you drink wine or beer or whatever, that they're making this stuff for us. Little known fact, by the way, this is where the power lies. Between Washington and Oregon, we control 79% of our vital strategic hop supply. 79% of the hops are grown in the Pacific Northwest. That's nationally. We're over 40% of global hops. So think about what would happen if Oregon and Washington were to do a hops embargo on the rest of the nation. We'll have them crying in their, not in their beer, I don't know, artisanal cider,
Yeah.
because you don't need hops for that. But this hops industry is there because of investments we made in electrification, irrigation, transportation, stuff which these regions couldn't have afforded to do on their own. The entire West is like that. And we also grow a lot of barley. So we could really, and by the way, we make almost all of the nation's wine on the West Coast.
I think you're highlighting angles of resistance we may yet have to tap. We'll see. What I was getting at was kind of whether we need to take better effective control of the dollars that we're exporting to the federal government, not necessarily arguing that the federal government has no role, but that things seem to be out of balance. Are there moves, David, that West Coast states or other states could be making to assert control of their financial futures that they're not tapping into today?
Yeah, so one interesting idea, which I don't think is talked about enough, is a state bank. There's only one state bank in the country, and that's North Dakota, who, interesting, is now experimenting with issuing a stable coin tied to the dollar. So if you think about money, there's a difference between currency and money. Like the federal government, they're the only ones who can issue U.S. currency. But most money is created by banks. If you understand the way the banking system works, when the bank loans you money, it creates on its own books, it has its double entry bookkeeping. There's an asset, which is the loan, and there's a liability, which is the one, if they lend you $100, that's the $100 they put into your checking account. They've literally created $100. It's not out of thin air, as some people say. They are securitizing your ability to repay it in the future. If it's a mortgage, you're putting your house up against it. If it's a housing bond, you're putting up the future income from what you're going to be building, etc. So it's not out of thin air. It's not unlimited, but you are creating money. So when you look at the types of investments, if we want to make investments that actually produce revenue in the future, like housing, we can get back to that. If we wanted to make a huge investment in publicly owned housing, we could, if we had a state bank, we could use that state bank to lend the money to public housing authorities at a very reasonable interest rate to build hundreds of thousands of units of affordable housing. It's literally just creating money to build housing. Now, again, there's lots of limits for how this works and how it works responsibly, but that is a possibility that we could start to take control of our own financial system, our own banking system. The states could do all of their business through the state bank, which helps create assets and reserves because their own deposits become part of the reserves of those banks. There's a lot of possibilities there. And also, I think it's interesting, the North Dakota experiment with a stable coin. It's a way to kind of issue your own currency. It's legal now to do that. And so if you issued a Pacific Coast stable coin that was legal currency for paying your taxes, well, that's essentially what gives money, fiat money, value. That is legal, and it allows states to expand the money supply regionally by floating stablecoin. Now, I haven't put a lot of thought into all of the potential downsides of this, but I think we're in tough times and it requires very creative thinking. We need to stop being constrained by the way we've done things in the past and start at least to explore more creative solutions. So that's definitely one way to do it.
And I'm so glad you brought this up. A guest on the episode that I think will just precede yours is Marco Rossi, who's part of the public banking movement here in Washington State and a part of a bigger public banking discussion.
He's probably made a better argument for it than I have.
Well, no, I think it's always interesting when you converge on similar ideas from different people. And the stablecoin thing is something I'd love to explore further on the show. I think there's something very interesting there. So let's talk about how we might spend creatively derived financial resources. You and your colleagues, Nick, and others at Civic Ventures are very focused in on affordability and equity and in particular looking at housing. And I think, as we talked before about, whether the West Coast could kind of set itself up as an example that would draw people from other parts of the country. I mean, one huge inhibitor to that is the West Coast is not a very affordable place to live. And in fact, we've shed people who have sought more affordability in Arizona and Texas and Georgia and other places. In this incredibly complex issue, what's the path forward to making more affordable housing available?
Right. So a lot of things have to be done simultaneously. There's no one solution to it. And I get into fights with the urbanist crowd all the time because they think I'm not sufficiently supportive of land use reform as a solution to this. The idea that we just allow people to build more. We make it too difficult and too expensive to build, both through zoning and regulations. And I agree with them, but I think that is necessary but not sufficient. So, for example, in Seattle, they recently have rezoned much of the city where you can now, I've got like a 6,400-foot lot. You could now knock my house down and build 4 townhouses. When prior to that, you couldn't. It was just the one house, and then more recently, you could do the 3-pack, which is a big house with an attached ADU. Anyway, so it's a lot more efficient. I imagine my 115-year-old house, when I sell, will likely be knocked down and replaced by 4 townhouses or more, depending on how they rezone in the future. But on its own, that's not going to create affordable housing. What will happen is you will take this stupidly expensive $900,000, $1 million house, whatever it sells for, and replace it by 4 $1.2 million townhouses. And there has been a ton of building in and around my neighborhood in the 28 years I've been here, and not a single residential unit that's gone up is more affordable than what had stood in its place or more affordable than the surrounding houses. We build to the as high up in the market as we can because it's land that's limited regardless, and you want to make as much profit off of a square foot of land as you can. So I think that a big part of the solution has to be what I call a public option for housing, what a lot of people call social housing, though I think that's a really terrible brand. It does not describe what it is. It makes you think it's in a commune, and that's not what it is. It's just basically a public option. It's publicly owned. It's rental. And theoretically, if our local laws would write, we could build cheaper than private developers. We can borrow money cheaper than private developers. And because we keep it out of the market over the long run, it doesn't inflate with the market. It only inflates with costs. And over most periods of time, that would mean the housing would grow cheaper over time. And the main constraint on it is you have to be able to bring in enough rent to cover your operating expenses and maintenance and your bond payments, your interest. So interest is really important. Ideally, with a functional federal government, the Treasury or the Fed would provide cheap money to do it. But again, like I said, you could potentially do that through a state bank. Either way, you can borrow money cheaper than a private developer.
You're blowing my mind and other people's minds right here, right now. To start off, you're saying, hey, there's this argument, and it's sort of put forward by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson in the Abundance book that, all we need to do is liberalize building requirements, and California and Washington and Oregon could look more like Texas. There'd be more construction, and that would solve our housing problem. And you're saying, sure, that's part of the solution. But to really get to affordability, we need to find affordable rentals, and that the best actor to do that is a public actor that could borrow money very cheaply and then get us on that cycle of...
And is not profit-seeking in the economic sense of it, not rent-seeking in the economic sense of the term. So the idea that you have an asset and you're trying to make as much money off of that asset as passively as possible. The public option doesn't do that. That's not their mission. Whereas that is, even if you're just like you and I, if we were to buy a house and rent it out to somebody, we're there to make money off of that, to maximize our profit. And when I sell my house, I'm not going to sell it, I think this family really could use it. No, that's my retirement or my daughter's inheritance. And she lives in LA. She'll really need that money. No, I'm going to get as much out of it as I can, regardless of what they do with this house. That is just natural That's the way the market works. So yes, my argument with the abundance, they're right about a lot of things, but what they're arguing for is a politics of abundance. But they don't have an economics of abundance. They're still tied into the orthodox, neoclassical, neoliberal way of thinking about how the economy works and where growth and prosperity comes from. And they don't have a new economic model, and economic narrative is upstream of political narrative. The way we understand the way the economy works influences our policies and our politics, not the other way around. Like, you don't have a politician give a speech and suddenly it's like, oh, I'm throwing out my Econ 101 textbook because this guy knows what he's talking about. It doesn't work that way. He's influenced by his Econ 101 textbook. So they have been unable to break, Ezra in particular, from that neoliberal way of thinking. And we have a different approach to how the economy works. And what we see is that prosperity grows from the middle out. It's from having a very large and inclusive and well-paid middle class. That's what drives the economy. It's what drives production. It's what drives innovation. For reasons we could spend a whole other episode on if you wanted to, but we model the economy as a virtuous cycle between innovation and demand. That's what markets do. Markets solve human problems. It's an evolutionary tool for discovering adaptive solutions. And it does that with people innovate, then consumers are literally the force of selection within that evolutionary system. And those things that consumers select, then that's what survives. That's what is amplified throughout the market and also becomes the base for future innovations. When you have a highly unequal economy like what we have, the only people who are really selecting for adaptation are the very wealthy. And so you get adaptations, you get innovations that are developed specifically for them, things they can afford. Like, watch a football game and see how many of the cars are for luxury cars as opposed to, so the cheapest car. It's all luxury cars on a football game, which everybody is watching, because who cares about the, bottom 90% of viewers? They can't afford to buy a new car anyway. So they're only selling luxury cars on a football game. So you get this less diverse selection of products. And then that has this effect down the line, because if we have a tenth of the types of products that we otherwise would have, because normal people can't afford to instantiate their demand, well, then that reduces the mimetic diversity from which future products and services will be innovated from, because innovation is path dependent.
You are, I think, the first person to utter the word mimetic on this podcast. Congratulations.
Well,
it's super interesting. I heard a great perspective, recent episode also from someone talking about tiny homes. And, his argument was, it's not the end all be all solution for our housing crisis, but what it highlights is that the way the housing market has worked is to basically build very large houses. So we have more square footage available per person than we've ever had. That square footage becomes very expensive and out of reach. So, the idea of like tiny homes or smaller homes that kind of fill in rungs in the housing ladder become very important. So it doesn't need to become 80% of what we're starting to build, but it becoming 20, 30, 40% is really about providing making that ladder available to a lot more people.
Right. And that, again, that's because you can make the most money per square foot in these markets by building the most expensive house that the market can support. So you will build these bigger homes. One of the mistakes that Ezra and Derek make is they talk about how we're not keeping up with demand. We're building less housing than we did 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago. And that is true if you're looking at the number of units of housing. It's not true when you look at square footage. We are building more housing per square foot than we ever did. It's just going into fewer units, so it's more square foot per person. And when you really get down to what is the constraint on our economy, what's the constraint on our housing construction industry, it isn't the number of units, it's the number of square feet. I mean, that's how we value housing, X dollars per square foot. There's a cost to it. When you want to build a house, it's going to cost you $400, $500, $600, whatever, $800 per square foot, because there are set costs involved in terms of supplies and labor. It doesn't cost that much more to build two 1,000-foot houses than it does to build one 2,000-foot house. It's wrong to say that we're not building housing anymore. We're building a shit ton of housing. They're just very large housing. By the square foot, we're building a lot of housing. An inequality problem, not a housing problem. There's a book by a couple professors at the University of Washington. I think it's an economist and a data scientist, called Homelessness is a Housing Problem. And Derek and Ezra cite one of the main conclusions of the book, and that is that homelessness correlates to housing prices, absolute housing prices, not relative housing prices, but absolute prices. And there's a lot of reasons why that would be true. It's because there's a floor to how much money you can earn, and there's always people at the low end, so absolute prices matter. So the higher the absolute price, generally, the higher your rate of homelessness. A lot of that makes sense. What they don't do is go on and explain the other correlation which these authors find, and that is that absolute housing prices relate to median incomes. So the more affluent your community is, the higher your housing, and therefore the higher the homelessness. So it's that inequality in a place like Washington, in a place like Seattle, that has led to this affordability crisis, which has led to this homelessness crisis. The good news there is that it is a symptom of affluence. We have a homelessness crisis and affordability crisis because our economy has been so strong, because we have created so many, not just good paying jobs, but great paying jobs in the tech industry and elsewhere, and because so many people have moved here to take those jobs. That's the good news, which means we're affluent. So California, Washington, to a lesser extent, Oregon, we can afford to address this if we choose to.
Well, here we are talking about the West Coast, two hot button issues, homelessness and affordable housing.
Mm-hmm.
Let me step way back from the absorbing kind of economics of all this to get to your point of view on why it is that housing is so critical to creating an enviable society on the West Coast.
First of all, what's the point of making an enviable society on the West Coast if nobody can afford to move here? We have a lack of geographic mobility, not just social mobility, but geographic mobility in this country. And we don't have just rising economic inequality, we have rising levels of geographic inequality. So when you look at what the Biden administration tried to do, laudably, if you look at the investments in the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS and Science Act, they put the majority of those investments into depressed areas of red states that really needed the economic development. You put a chip plant into King County, outside of Seattle, it's just going to drive up wages, right? Because so you put it into you're trying to share the wealth, build up that economy. Unfortunately, Trump has canceled a lot of these, the battery plants and the chip plants and so forth, because it was something Biden did, and it's all about trolling the Dems. I mean, that's his. How much can I enrich myself? How much can I anger Democrats? That's basically what motivates him.
And usually at the expense of people who voted for him.
Well, he doesn't care because he doesn't believe he'll ever have to face another election. It's the only way you can understand what Republicans are doing, because they just do unpopular thing after unpopular thing. You don't do that if you worry about elections anymore. I don't think they really. He made that promise to evangelicals: you vote for me this time, you'll never have to vote again. I think, take him at his word there. That's what they are intending to do. First of all, we can't grow our economy inclusively. We can't build a prosperous and inclusive middle class unless we have affordable housing. Think about what it means. So our focus it's the middle class. The median is the message. What we want is a large, thriving, prosperous, and secure middle class. What does it mean to be middle class? It's not an income range. What you have is access to high quality, affordable housing, education, healthcare, childcare, and transportation. There's other things involved, but those are the 5 things that largely define a middle class life. You're never going to go hungry. You're never going to go homeless. You're going to be able to get an education. Your children will be able to get an education. There's childcare affordable enough so that you can afford to go to work, etc. That's what it means to be middle class. There's another thing about being middle class, which I think is not considered enough. So those, again, on an affordability basis, those are the things. One way to fix that is with higher wages, obviously, but also investments in providing these programs and investments. The other thing is you're never truly middle class if you're living in constant fear of falling out of the middle class. And that is why, for you or your children, if you're afraid that, you have to spend all this money, getting advantages for your children so that maybe they'll be able to have a middle class life too, and you're living in constant, and I joke all the time that the only way my daughter will ever own a house like the one she grew up in Seattle is if I die in it. She's an only child. That's really the extent of my estate planning. So, if I'm still owning the house, she'll own the house someday. You need to have a certain level of support programs built into the economy. You need to have a healthcare system that you can't fall out of. If things go bad, maybe you can't afford to buy a house or you can't afford to keep your house, but you can rent a place that will be decent and your rent's not going to be jacked up 20% every year. It's going to increase with costs, right? Stable housing. It means you don't have to save so much money for retirement because a lot of the expenses of retirement aren't there anymore. If you are in a public option, you can retire in place and stay there because you get one of the main benefits of home ownership, and that is built-in rent control. That is what a 30-year fixed rate mortgage is. It's a form of rent control. It locks in the largest part of your monthly payment month after month for 30 years. It buys you housing stability. So if we want a large, thriving middle class, we need housing stability, we need income stability, we need health stability, we need education stability, childcare stability. We don't need these things just to be affordable, but we need to be able to know that they'll always be there. And at a certain income level, people have that. What we want is for more people to have that. That's what it means to build an enviable economy for the West Coast. There's all of the political freedoms aside. We want all those things too, but we want economic freedom, which is what wealth buys you, or a good social insurance system buys you. And that's what a lot of the European countries have. You know that if you get sick, it won't bankrupt you. There's no way that walking across the street and getting hit by a car at the wrong time is going to make you lose your house. It just can't happen because your healthcare is covered.
You're really helping me connect the dots between some of your earlier points, this idea that the politics of abundance have to come with the economics of abundance. And here you're pointed at, a very practical approach to delivering the economics of abundance by proliferating affordable housing for a lot of different kinds of people at a lot of different life stages. So then, David, what's getting in the way of that on the West Coast? Because to me, you're circling right around what is critical to actually achieving a form of sovereignty, with whether we're inside or outside of the United States, a form of sovereignty and control over our own destiny in this region. What's getting in the way?
So I think it's a lack of imagination, amongst other things, but also bad incentives that the current economy has created for us. Like I said, homeowners, it's not in their interest to solve this problem. It's counter to their interest because they've already bought into it. And part of the lack of imagination comes from the inability to, you have to understand that every problem you solve creates new problems. And so when you go to try to solve a problem, you need to imagine the world, how this will now function in the world that you create. So let's say Ezra Klein is right, and we can eliminate zoning and eliminate regulations, and we have this boom in housing construction. And the price of buying a single-family house plummets. It's cut in half. It's like now twice as affordable to buy a house than it used to be. It's going to devastate people who were relying on their housing value, right? It's good in that for younger people who want to buy a house, but it's going to devastate the people who are already bought into the current system. It's going to destroy their retirements. It's going to wipe out like I said, most American homeowners, their largest asset is the equity in their home. So you have to imagine the world you're trying to create, what that will look like. And we never get that far because it's so hard to actually achieve real change in this country. So it almost seems like a waste of time to imagine that many steps into the future. And in our office, one of the things we say is that we need a new economics. We need to start thinking about how the economy works differently. We are in the midst of an interrelated crisis of inequality, climate, and democracy. They appear like separate crises, but they're all part of the same system. And that is largely due to the way we tend to artificially separate things into these categories. The idea of there being an economy that was separate from politics, that is a 20th century idea. Nobody thought of an economy. It was political economy when people started writing about it. No, you just didn't think that way. And you wouldn't think of the environment as being outside of the economy or of politics because, traditionally in an agricultural, where most people were working in agriculture, droughts, irrigation, soil erosion, labor to plow, all those things mattered. So a steady climate was really important. And responding to climate crises was really important. The idea that it's separate, that we can't afford to fix the climate, it costs us too much money. Or the idea that somehow there are these political problems that are separate. No. The political problems are there because of the half century of rising inequality. If you had simply kept distribution levels constant at their 1975 level, like people earning what share of income you got it, 10% or 40% or 50% or 70% or 90% or 1%. If you had just kept those income distributions constant. At the median, people would be earning almost twice as much today as they are now. That's the counterfactual. When you look at that counterfactual, and this is from work done by the RAND Corporation, so that's stuff we did on the back of the napkin in our office. They have done a series of studies on this. When you look at the past 50 years, in 2024 alone, it was $3.5 trillion. That's how much less the bottom 90% made than they otherwise would have had income distributions remained constant. And that meant incomes rising with productivity, rising in step with the economy, just like they had been for the previous 30, 40 years. Over that 50 years, that has resulted in a $79 trillion upward redistribution of wealth and income. The top 1% have $79 trillion more. The bottom 90% have $79 trillion less than they otherwise would have had distributions remained constant. Imagine how much different our politics might be today if people were making twice as much at the median as they are now. Imagine if the bottom 90% of Americans were $79 trillion richer than they are today. How they might have spent that money, how they might have saved that money, how they might have built economic security and stability for themselves and their children. And imagine how much less angry they would be at elites on either side of the political spectrum, and how much less discontent fascists like Trump would have to play with in order to seize power and enact their own agenda, which is basically just an agenda that favors the rich and powerful. They are not Democrats, small d Democrats. They are, as I like to explain to people from other countries, this is a two-party system consisting of the Democratic Party and the undemocratic party. That is what the Republican Party has become. They do not believe in democracy. And that's actually built into neoliberalism, this idea that only the elites are qualified to make decisions. And by elites, we mean people with money. People with money are the people with power. They're the ones, the Elon Musks who should be telling us how to run the country and how to run the economy. So That's always existed, that idea from the elites. There wouldn't be that much support for that type of radical change if this was a more equitable economy.
And I think you're pointing at any number of ways, any number of policy decisions we could start to make to shift towards something more equitable. And until then, even the language, even the idea of a social safety net just sounds like so many Marie Antoinette's offering to let the peasants eat cake.
You know, the great economist John Maynard Keynes once famously said, anything we can do, we can afford. And I think that is the attitude that we on the West Coast, especially since collectively we are so affluent, that is the attitude we should make. And we should not look at these things as impossible or, too expensive. We can't afford the taxes. Let me be clear. There is no empirical evidence to support the assertion that raising top marginal tax rates reduces growth. I know the Econ 101 textbooks say that's true. There is no evidence to support the argument that raising the minimum wage kills jobs. It's classic economics, and there's a logic behind it. And we've been raised to understand the world within that story, and that limits us. We're self-limiting. We're being self-compliant and pre-compliant, not just to Trump, to the fascists, but to the billionaires, to the owners of capital. And I'm not anti-market. I'm pro-market. The market capitalism, I don't think that's the proper term for it anymore. I don't think capital is all that important. It's people that are important. It's the way it organizes people, the way it uses our imagination and evolves innovative solutions. But it is the greatest problem-solving social technology ever invented. There is no question that on average and in the aggregate, we are now healthier, longer lived, more comfortable, and we lead lives that are potentially more fulfilling than at any time in human history. But of course, we don't live in the aggregate or in the long run. We live in individual lives in the here and now. And the other thing about markets is that they generate inequality. Left to their own devices, they will always generate radical inequality. It's built into the mathematics of the market. It is inevitable. It will happen. And unconstrained by a functional democracy through regulation and redistribution, you will end up with what we are ending up with, what we have ended up with. So I think the message to people in the Pacific states is throw out your old economics, understand where prosperity really comes from. It's by solving problems, not by, efficiently using capital. And it comes from people, and figure out how to include more people in your economy. And the only way to do that is to build a large, well-paid, robust, and secure middle class. So anything that's good for the middle class, anything that pulls more people into it and that improves outcomes for the middle class, anything you do for the middle class is good for the economy. And anything we do for a middle class fueled economy, for a more equal economy, is good for our politics and good for our democracy.
So if Goldy's right, we can acknowledge that our economy is rigged and that we're lucky on the West Coast to have the talent, capital, and moral clarity to rig it differently. We can build a regional economy that dares to center public good. Offering public options isn't about handouts for the desperate or the poor, nor is it just a safety net for when the bottom falls out. Innovative public options, drawing from examples around the US and the world, offer a floor that lets everyone stand taller. They give immigrant kids a chance to start without fear of falling. They enable college grads to take creative risks without drowning in rent or debt. They give middle-aged parents the stability to raise families in the same communities they grew up in, and they offer grandparents the chance to retire without becoming someone else's burden. Look sideways at people that label this as socialism or try to suggest the private sector, for all its breathtaking pace and power, has all of the answers. Caring for communities is cool, and we have an economy that can serve us instead of the markets. I don't think billionaires or big companies are bad guys, but I think they do unfairly benefit in our economy as designed, and it comes at our expense in ways that are increasingly visible. Establishing public options for housing, for healthcare, for banking, these are not giveaways. They're scaffolding for a modern society, the infrastructure of freedom. They keep the middle class solid, the young hopeful, and the old secure. So the real question isn't whether we can afford them, it's whether we can afford not to have them. The economy is rigged, yes, but that does not need to be our destiny. Certainly not on the West Coast, where disrupting broken systems and innovating is what we do. We can unrig the economy, not by retreating into smaller dreams or cowering in the face of countless federal offenses, but by building public goods that make it possible for all of us to rest easier. I'm Greg Amrofell. Thanks for being with me in Pacific Time. If this episode inspired you, please share it with the dreamers, the college kids, the working parents, and the grandparents. Ask them what basic needs give them the most stress and what it would feel like if we can make it all more manageable. And please join the conversation on YouTube, Substack, and Instagram at Pacific Time Podcast. See you next time.